Welcome to The Constitution is the Solution, a 6-lecture series on the U.S. Constitution. First, I'd like to tell a little bit about my own background. A number of years ago, a friend invited me to a class on the U.S. Constitution, which he informed me would be held in my living room. So I showed up. During that series of classes on the Constitution, we learned a few things. First, we learned that our nation is not really following the Constitution today. That wasn't much of a surprise, really, though. But we also learned that if we were to follow the Constitution again today, it would solve a majority of the problems our nation is facing. I also learned within myself that I had real passion for these things. I had awakened in me a desire to learn more about the Constitution, and especially how can we defend it? How can we bring our nation back to the Constitution again? So from that course, I felt like the course that we went through at that time really didn't address those questions adequately. I began looking for another course on the Constitution, one that would more specifically focus on what we need to know to defend the Constitution, to get our nation back to the Constitution again. What I found was there are many courses on the Constitution, the majority of which talk about the Constitution rather than getting into it. Very few of them actually open the Constitution, read the words, and discuss the meaning of those words. Now, I did find a few courses that actually do get into the Constitution, but so many of those seem to spend most of their time on trivia, such as, what is the minimum age requirement to run for a U.S. House of Representatives? Now, the answer to that is 25, but I don't think that's the problem our nation's facing today. I don't see a lot of 24-year-olds trying to sneak in and ruin our nation. The problems we face as a nation are much more significant than that, and the parts of the Constitution that are being ignored are very unknown to most people in this nation. So I've looked for many years for a course that gives us those tools, what we need to know to be able to defend the Constitution. And finally, we decided we needed to create one that very concisely arms you with the tools to defend the Constitution in the crucial ways it's being violated today. What are the powers of Congress? What can they legislate? What can they not legislate? Can we draw a clear line? And so on. Now, often when we're engaged in this type of a discussion, what are really the powers of Congress? What does the Constitution really mean? Sometimes people will ask, well, how do you know what the Constitution means? Are you a lawyer? And, well, no, I'm not a lawyer. But this brings up an interesting comparison. There are really two types of approaches to the Constitution today. If you were to go to law school, chances are you'll be taught what's called case law. Case law is based upon the most recent Supreme Court rulings. It's the idea that the Constitution means whatever the Supreme Court says it means, regardless of if that is based in any of the words in the Constitution or not. Original intent looks back to the Constitution itself. Let's look at what the words said and what they meant and what those who wrote them described and explained it to mean. Very different approaches. My background is actually in engineering, but that's given me an interesting perspective on this approach. When you're drafting a building, starting at the upper left-hand corner of the building, and you measure into the first window 2 feet. And let's say that the margin of error there is a ½ inch. It could be plus or minus a ½ inch for its exact location. Then the window casing itself is also measured plus or minus a ½ inch, 2 feet wide. What you end up with is the other side of that window's position is plus or minus an inch. You could be off an inch too short or too far. And if we then take that final position and measure to the next window, another 2 feet, and then from the final position of that window, you measure another 2 feet over, and on, you get to the point where you have 5 windows, and then you get to the last window and measure over another 2 feet to the final wall. By this point, you have a total error of up to 6 inches, which means the final corner of your wall could be 21½ feet from the first wall. It could be 22½ feet from the first wall when the design actually specified for 22 feet. You're adding up your error if you start where the last one was and go from there. This is how case law works. If a case is ruled in the Supreme Court that is 1 degree off the original intent of the Constitution, and we start there with our next ruling, we start 1 degree off, we might introduce another degree further off course. It doesn't take very many cases before we're far off course from the original intent. If instead we always go back to the original source, in this case In engineering, this is called a datum plane. You go back to the original point of reference and take every measurement from that same source. You're never more than a ½ inch off in any of your measurements. In the same way, if every case goes back to the Constitution for its rulings, errors that may have been introduced in the past can be resolved again. Let's go back and look at the original wording and see what it says. So if I were trained as a lawyer, chances are I'd be trained in case law and I'd understand cases, but not the Constitution. It's actually possible to graduate, to get a degree in law and everything, without ever having actually read the Constitution, because that's not what we focus on in law school. Most of the time you'll focus on cases that define what our legal system is today. Two very different approaches. Unfortunately, the prevailing viewpoint is case law in our country today, which has taken us far away from what the Constitution actually says. Now, the original intent of the Constitution can be known. It's rather easy, really, to find. Those who advocated the Constitution wrote extensively on what it meant. Probably the greatest resource is The Federalist, also known as the Federalist Papers. This was a series of about 85 letters to the editor, written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. In New York State, they were writing to the papers there to explain to the people of New York what the Constitution meant and why they should ratify it, why they should adopt it as our new form of government. So they went through many of the common concerns, questions, and misconceptions of the Constitution and explained them very thoroughly. So you'll find during these 6 lectures, we'll often refer to the Federalist Papers to understand what they meant by the words that were in the Constitution. These words have meaning, and that meaning can be known. So again, welcome to this 6-lecture course on the U.S. Constitution. We hope you find the information presented here useful to you in helping you and your community understand and defend the U.S. Constitution.